All right. It is the week of January 29th, 2023, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we've got a ton to break down. First, we're going to talk about Jorge Masvidal's recent contract negotiations with the UFC, as well as his split from first-round management. A lot to unpack there, specifically how, MMA managers and agents are interacting with bigger name value guys in the sport, specifically UFC stars, and the ramifications this may have going forward, because there could be some issues down the line with MMA management and future bigger name fighters. So we'll break that down first. Then we're going to talk about Paramount Plus and Showtime merging. So Viacom CBS announced that the two will merge. If you have the Showtime linear channel, it will become Paramount Plus with Showtime. At some point, the Showtime app will probably sunset. A lot to unpack there for Bellator's owner and broadcast media partner. And we're going to talk about how it affects Bellator moving forward, as well as how much of that probably factored into the rumors that Bellator was for sale. Then we're going to talk about Combate, not Combate Global, the promotion, but Combate, the media company in Brazil, who has dropped the UFC rights and instead picked up rights to broadcast pretty much every other MMA promotion. We're going to talk about the strategy of that, what the ramifications could mean for other international markets in MMA, and how this is kind of a test case for somebody who's going to go a different direction from the UFC but still have MMA content. It's a big deal, so we'll have to spend some time on that. Then we're going to talk about Prime Energy sponsorship between the UFC and then Logan Paul and KSI's Prime Energy drink. Lots to unpack there. It'll be a really fun time. Highly suggest listening to that one. Then we'll have our quick hits. And last but not least, we're going to do a very quick touch on a tweet that Conor McGregor sent out talking about being offered to do The Ultimate Fighter. Don't know if it's going to happen or not, but we're going to really look into whether or not that's a good deal or bad deal for the UFC and for McGregor to have him host The Ultimate Fighter now that he's reached the level of stardom that he has. So timestamps at the bottom as always, and let's go ahead and dive right in. All right. So first up, we're going to talk about Jorge Masvidal's recent contract negotiations and split from first-round management. So this article comes from MMA Fighting by Steven Morocco. The interview itself came from the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani, with Masvidal on there. And I quote, this is from Masvidal, the last 3 or 4 years, I've been negotiating my contracts, Masvidal said. I've been getting on the plane and going over there to Vegas and sitting down in front of Hunter Campbell, UFC COO, or sitting down in front of UFC President Dana White and saying, like, well, this is my worth and this is why I think so. And they tell me to go F and fly a kite. And we have another meeting the next week, and then we talk, and then we come to the agreements. I told FRM co-owner Abe Kawa, if I get on the plane and put 10 and a half hours on my back and take that off from training to go over there and talk to somebody, why am I giving you a percentage again? Because you don't set up my training. You don't pay for my training. You don't step in the cage. Like, what am I doing? You're setting up interviews? Oh, you're talking to Ariel Helwani for me? No, you got it. You got to do a little bit more than that. FRM's from first round management, Kawa, declined to comment on the Masvidal interview when contacted by MMA Fighting and didn't confirm or deny any lawsuits. Masvidal went on to say, quote, I don't owe them any money. They don't owe me any money, but there's other things that have affected the relationship severely that they could fix or they could have fixed by now. But they haven't, so I'm waiting for these things to get resolved, and we'll see what happens. And hopefully, they see the light and they make my life easier so I can make their life easier. Also, article goes on to talk about Aljamain Sterling splitting from first round management and having issues, as well as the 2020 survey of MMA fighters conducted by The Athletic that said that 44% of MMA fighters said MMA managers didn't adequately represent their interests. So, lot to unpack here. And again, this is not the first name from the UFC that has done this. We've seen Aljamain Sterling leave first round management and kind of do his own thing. We've seen Masvidal. We've seen even Francis Ngannou, who split from Markel Martin when he was trying to renegotiate recently. There's been a lot of good information out there about how MMA managers really work. There are these middlemen, right? Specifically, if you look at, what Nash and I believe Jason Cruz also did some stuff on it, but John Nash, obviously, and Michael Fidel, when he worked at the Body Lock, did a great article about Ali Abdelaziz's involvement in the PFL. MMA managers are there to build a relationship with the promotion and feed fighters into the organization. That's really their primary purpose and their primary business strategy, right? You have from the antitrust lawsuit emails that show these managers, well-known managers, uh, sending emails to Joe Silva, trying to get certain fights and negotiating a little bit here and there, but often, you know, acquiescing to Silva's demands or just trying to make sure Silva is happy, right? And there's some negotiation there. There is, but it's not a ton, right? Largely, as we know from the antitrust lawsuit and the communications that were revealed, the UFC for the longest time essentially had a formulaic structure unless you became a star or were pegged to be a possible star, and then you could negotiate a certain amount. But otherwise, it was, you have this many fights on your first contract around this pay range. You go up to the next step, and it was a basic pay increase ladder where if you kept being re-signed, you would get more money based on a formula, right? And that's how the majority of fighters were handled. So even though you have a manager with a stable of maybe, 20, 30 fighters in the UFC, most of them are going by a formula that was set by Joe Silva in the UFC itself. And now it would probably be Hunter Campbell. And, Dana might be involved in it, but from everything I've heard, Campbell is essentially the main driver of it. So managers back in the day also used to help you with sponsorships, right? You used to be able to put a bunch of stuff on your shorts. You'd have these banners. There's that infamous video of BJ Penn being on the cage, and then they're trying to unroll his banner, and he's like, look it up, like, what's going on? Used to be very different. You could be sponsored by a bunch of different companies. You could get sponsorships easily. That's gone now with the new athlete policy changes and uniform changes that the UFC rolled out back in 2016 with the Reebok deal. That's gone. So at this point, managers are still there to help you get into the UFC or Bellator or PFL, one of the major leagues, right? If you're trying to be a pro fighter, you want to get into what you would call one of the big four promotions, they're still there to help you do that. But beyond that, they don't do nearly as much. Now, if you're in Bellator, right, where you're able to have your own sponsors and it's a little bit more free, they probably can do more things for you. But if you're in PFL, if you're in UFC, I don't really know too much of. That's a little bit of a gray area, but I mean, they're not doing what they used to in that regard. And you're paying a pretty big percentage, right? Like sometimes 10%, more than 10% to your manager to do these things of your fight purses. And so as Masvidal states, right, I'm the one going over there and getting FaceTime with Dana and Hunter Campbell to have these negotiations. Why am I paying you this huge percentage? It's a good question. And I think that's something, especially when you're locked into these 6-8 fight contracts, right? Which is what the UFC loves to do once you're at a certain level to them. What is the point of having a manager? What is the real representation there? If they're not going out and getting you certain sponsorships and building your brand and doing those things, well, you're paying for a service that you don't need anymore, is how a lot of these fighters probably fear. And you have, again, multiple fighters who negotiated their own contracts. I know, obviously, with James Krause, you have the whole betting situation, but he openly talked about renegotiating his contract himself and essentially, doing well when he stepped into certain, last minute fights and all this other stuff. And he was fine, right? He was happy with the money he was making. He wasn't giving a percentage to management, and he was able to renegotiate it. That's a very good thing for him. That saved him a lot of money, which he probably needs right now. But this is kind of a realization fighters are having, I think, right? Where this information has been out there for quite some time, but fighters have not really picked up on it. Management only takes you so far once you hit a certain level. When you've got name value, when you're not in jeopardy of being cut for certain reasons, when multiple promotions want you, managers can't help you negotiate that much more than your for some of these longer deal contracts. And it doesn't make sense to pay them all of those, fight percentages if all they're doing is picking up a phone to set up, like Masvidal said, interviews, right? Basically giving the green light, like, yeah, you can go on Hawani's show. Yeah, you can go on, Sirius XM, what have, like, it doesn't make a ton of sense. So I think as time goes on, you're going to see more and more bigger name guys start to say, why am I paying these managers? And management's going to be relegated more into getting guys in the UFC initially. Now, when you sign a management contract, right, it is similar to the UFC where you're under so many years, you have to pay a certain percentage. Those contracts could be lengthened if all of a sudden a bunch of top name fighters are splitting from their managers. There's a lot of things these managers could do to kind of hold on to their money and to keep building their business. But I think we're starting to see what was in the inevitable tipping point of managers being phased out once you reach a level of superstardom, right? And it doesn't have to be crossover, McGregor, Rousey, all that stuff. In fact, at that point, you probably need a different type of manager, which even McGregor mentioned when Ngannou left, right? Like at that point, it's more about building other deals that are way outside the UFC and all of that. But if you're in the MMA bubble and you're a name in the MMA bubble, you don't necessarily need these managers, and especially in the same way that you do initially. So I think moving forward, we're going to see more and more managers be phased out by the top tier guys. I'd say probably ranked top 10 and above, or, if you're just kind of a dude who makes a name for himself, through violence or, enough of a name in the sport, you're going to phase out your managers. And I think it's going to become more clear that the real job of a manager is them to make money with these bigger promotions. Their actual first client is the UFC or Bellator or one or what have you. That's their main priority. Because if they lose that relationship, they're in trouble, right? Because their salary is based on a percentage of your winnings. So if you can't get into a pro organization, their money is capped as well. Their commission is capped. They don't want that. So they're always going to push come to shove, make sure that the organization comes first to protect that relationship. Because if you're being a real pain in the butt for a particular organization, and yes, they can make some money off you, but it's threatening or jeopardizing their relationship with like the UFC when they've got 10 other fighters with the UFC, I mean, they're going to pick the UFC every time. That's just how it is. So again, I think that's where we're going to see the shift. Would love to know your guys' thoughts on this about whether or not you think Masvidal is making the right call here. I personally think it's a good move by him, right? I mean, it saves him a ton of money. He's obviously having the direct negotiations with Hunter and Dana. Why not? I think it's a loss for Abe Kawa, and I think going forward, it's going to be harder for these managers to stay in business with guys that are making high 6-figure, 7-figure contracts, even low 6-figure, maybe, right? Like we'll see where this goes, but I think you're going to see that shift more and more. It's slowly happening, but fighters are coming to the realization, wait a minute, it doesn't have to work this way. They are being educated enough. There's enough examples out there too, where they're kind of learning, okay, maybe I don't need to do it this way just because that's how it's always been done. Or things have really shifted in the past 5 or 6 years. I need to reevaluate things. That's really changing their perspective. So I think you're going to see more of this. I think you're going to see more people doing Max Holloway type stuff where he got a manager that really is building his brand, trying to do things outside of MMA. I think that's where MMA management and agents are going. Still going to have a need for them to get into the UFC or Bellator or any of the bigger promotions. Without a doubt, they're not going away, but they're going to have a harder time keeping track of, some of these bigger name stars, unless they have them go over to, Ramzan Kadyrov's compound and do meet and greets with him for big money and stuff like that. They're going to have to start getting inventive with ways to get these fighters paid where it makes sense for the fighters to keep them around. So overall, I think it's a good thing for the sport and for fighters. I think for MMA managers, their old model is dying and they need to adapt quickly. That's my thoughts on it. Let me know your guys' thoughts. If you think Masvidal is smart to renegotiate himself, or you think he should join with the manager, be curious to hear what you guys are thinking. All right. Next up, we're going to cover the announcement that Paramount Global has joined Paramount Plus and Showtime. So this comes from an article on January 30th from CNBC. Quote, Paramount Global is further joining its streaming cable TV business by combining its Showtime TV network and streaming service Paramount Plus. The company said Monday it plans to integrate Showtime streaming service fully into Paramount Plus. So Showtime app will die at some point and it will just be Paramount Plus. It will also say, as part of the integration, the premium cable TV network will be rebranded as Paramount Plus with Showtime and will feature content from Paramount Plus. Pricing for the combined streaming platform and other details will be announced in the coming weeks. So right now, Paramount Plus starts at $4.99 a month and Showtime starts at $10.99 a month. A bundled offering exists for $11.99 a month. Back in November, Paramount reported that Paramount Plus had 46 million customers, and the company reports fourth quarter earnings February 16th. So this is important. And it goes on to talk about this article, kind of the streaming wars, how there's renewed pressure on streaming profitability, which is very true. So it is a scenario where we've been in this crazy bull market, right? In terms of macroeconomic conditions, it's been one of the best bull markets in history, longest bull market in history, I believe. And it's just been crazy great until the pandemic. And then you had that dip and then it kind of came back. And now there's a lot of fear going on, a lot of, recession talk, the Fed really pumping up interest rates, all this other stuff. The macro conditionings are worsening, and there's more pressure than ever for investors, really companies by investors, to make some of these streaming platforms profitable. They were introduced as part of the cord cutting, bonanza in the past decade or so. Netflix obviously had the head start there, and then you saw Hulu and now ESPN Plus, and all of these networks are now creating their own streaming service that houses their content, and they're showing all of this stuff. And the important part here is that right now, none of these are profitable. In fact, they're loss leaders. They are something where, okay, we know we're going to lose a ton of money on this, but we need this to exist because eventually it's going to turn a profit and it's going to be our new model, right? This is the hard transition for all of those companies from the cable era to the streaming era. That's what this is. And the belief has been, okay, yep, there's going to be losses initially. Subscribers and paid subscriber growth are going to continue. Eventually, it's going to end up being profitable and make sense. That's not been the case. Every single streaming deal right now that I've heard of has been pretty big loss leader in terms of, yep, we've got a bunch of new subscribers, right? 46 million for Paramount Plus, but it's not turning a profit based on how much producing content is. And, ad and media space. Ad space in particular has been kind of slow. If you haven't noticed, right, ad space is still king on TV, but if you watch a show on a streaming network that has ads, you'll often get the same couple ads repeated over and over and over again. The best example of this recently is, Thursday Night Football on Peacock, where everybody was talking about the Burger King Whopper song ad because it just kept playing over and over and over again. And that highlights a huge amount of revenue loss compared to TV. I mean, that's TV. Essentially, advertising was king. The more ads you got, the bigger ads you got, the more viewers you had, the more profitable it was. They're trying to do that with streaming. It's not there yet. And so in response to this, what a lot of companies are trying to do, especially as things kind of turn downwards and debt becomes more expensive to borrow, is they're trying to figure out ways to get more revenue in that's fixed and or at least should be fixed, right? And cut costs. And so with this merger, this article goes on to talk about how um, you know, some of the shows have been cut. And there's another article from Vulture that discusses how many shows have been cut and just shut down, including one with, what is it? The Three Women, which was a new series that currently had Star and Star Shailene Woodley promoting the show, like going out on tour after it'd been wrapped, and now it's been canceled. They also let go of Gigolo, Let the Right One In, Twilight Zone reboot, Real World, Homecoming, Coyote, No Activity, et cetera, et cetera. They're cutting these shows. And again, they're not the first to do it. HBO and Warner Brothers. If you didn't read about that, the amount of movies, you had the Batgirl movie, right? Fully finished in production, done, complete. I think it was 90 or 9 million or something like that, $90 million movie or something like that, just shelved and gone. And not only are they cutting these shows, they're removing them from the platform. And they do that because if you leave a show up there, then you still have to pay out royalties based on views, right? Most of the way these contracts are worded is if I'm a star in a show or a producer for a particular show or movie and it's on a streaming service, depending on how many views that gets, I get a royalty check, right? Again, depends on the specifics of your contracts. But if you have royalties, which some of the bigger stars do, you end up getting a kickback. That was the whole lawsuit between Scarlett Johansson and Disney Plus, right? They released Black Widow on Disney Plus instead of in theaters, and part of her contract was about certain ticket sales, which obviously didn't really happen since they went straight to streaming, and a lot of people just ended up streaming instead of going to the theater to watch it during the pandemic. So they're cutting these shows and then removing them from the service so that they don't have to pay royalties, and it cut costs. And some of these can be write-offs, right? Like that's the whole thing with Warner and HBO, where, David Z, good old CEO David Z, said, "Oh, well, we're going to get a bunch of write-offs because we're just not releasing these, or we're cutting these movies," and that will help, hypothetically. But it's all about cutting costs as debt becomes more expensive, right? Because this is not a profitable business. Streaming is not profitable yet. It's not there. It just simply isn't. I know there have been videos out there recently comparing, streaming services and with Fight Pass and all this other stuff, but they're not profitable. It doesn't work that way. And so how this affects somebody like Bellator, right, who is on Showtime, this is kind of a precursor to what I believe most MMA promotions are going to face. That's how this ties all back into MMA. Bellator has been rumored now for, I'd say, not quite a month, but near a month, I think, been rumored, or it's been out there, that they've been rumored to be looking for a buyer. It would make sense that from Viacom CBS's eyes, as they cut multiple shows and everything, they've got a live sports entity, which should hypothetically be valuable to a potential buyer, but they may be looking to cut Bellator. Now, are they cutting them right now? I'm not saying that, but could they in the future if numbers don't improve, if it again becomes a kind of costly endeavor? Yeah. As we know, or at least recently, as we know, Bellator is profitable, right? They have, at least in the past, been profitable. They in the UFC are one of the only two bigger organizations that are actually turning a profit. So to cut Bellator isn't necessarily the best move, but if they brought them in-house to Showtime and now they're not producing the kind of advertising they like, or certain production costs have gone up, streaming isn't really tied to, subscribers aren't tied to Bellator that much, they might be looking to offload it. It's not necessarily that they'll completely shut it down and say, okay, we're done with this, but they very well might be saying, look, somebody take this off our hands because it's okay, but it's not making the kind of money we want. And we'd rather, take what should be a valuable property since everybody wants live sports, right? And have somebody else buy it. I'm sure that Viacom CBS looked at what one did with Amazon and saw how desperate Amazon was for getting into this space, and hearing the rumors about Netflix wanting to get into live sports, right? Hearing about all of the live sports debates going on. Google's in there now with YouTube TV. Saw that and thought, okay, this is a little bit of profit for us, but maybe we can make a lot more money rolling it off because it's not worth keeping on our books. And then we cut our costs. We end up with a nice chunk of change, and we can use that money instead to produce, more hit shows and drive subscriber growth through that. Wouldn't be shocked at all if that was the thinking of sending the rumors and floaters out there like, hey, if somebody wants to buy this, we'll totally entertain the idea. So 2 scenarios here. One, what if there's a buyer, right? Well, my guess is negotiations will happen between Viacom and CBS and whoever the potential buyer would be. And Viacom will at least keep in their back pocket like, hey, this is not a huge loss leader for us, so we're not going to just give this away. We're not just looking to offshore it no matter what. And it's a known sports property. It's this, in terms of revenue, it's the second biggest MMA promotion. And they kind of draw a certain line in the sand and say, we want this much. If we don't get it, well, that's not ideal, but we'll probably still keep Bellator going because it does enough for us, right? Because if they were profitable with Paramount originally, one would assume it's still profitable in-house. Whether or not that's true, we don't know the exact amounts, right? But I would imagine it is not a product that is really hurting them or burning a hole in their pocketbook. So they'll probably be like, all right, we'll keep it around, but we'd prefer to get more money. And here's our line. If there is no seller, I think they keep Bellator for a while. If they're not getting the return they want, or if they have to do further cost-cutting measures, Bellator could be in trouble, right? If the macroeconomic environment turns fast and somebody like Viacom CBS needs to do even more cost-cutting, and they start cutting even more popular shows or shows that are making a profit, Bellator might be on that list. You would assume if that happened, somebody would pick it up after it was released, right? After it was kind of cut. And it might be rebranded as a new organization, similar to what happened with, Strikeforce, right? Where, Bellator is not Strikeforce, obviously, but the same type of deal where Strikeforce was bought out by the UFC, and then Bellator was formed sometime later, and Scott Coker went back and kind of ran Bellator, and now has kind of tried to make it a alternative to the UFC. I would imagine Bellator gets shut down. There's certain buyouts and restrictions from going out and starting a particular organization, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'd guess that most of the current contracted Bellator fighters would be released from contracts and be free to go to bigger orgs. And then at some time, there's some new promotion that pops up, right? Might not happen that way, but it could. But even in that scenario, right, where things get really doom and gloom, I don't think that's happening anytime soon. I think definitely through 2023 and probably at least through 2024, Bellator will be fine. Things would have to take a pretty sharp turn, and it would have to have a bad, dire outlook for something like that to be cut, especially when it's making money technically. They're going to want to, as long as it's making money, they're going to want to keep it because it helps them, even if it's just a small amount. So there'd have to be a couple things happening there for Bellator to actually shut down. But that's my analysis of that. Is at this point, it's really more of a, yeah, we'll keep it and we'll use it, but we would prefer to sell it for a higher price so we can focus on producing newer shows or doing other things that might be more profitable than what Bellator is bringing in. You will continue to see more mergers and more bundles and offshoots and things of that nature, right? Don't forget, ESPN has been rumored to be on the chopping block and being sold by Disney for quite some time. And ESPN is more of a loss leader. Their recent earnings show ESPN Plus has losses that have grown significantly. That's going to eventually be a problem for Disney if those losses continue to grow and they don't get the return they want, especially with UFC rights being so pricey. And as we'll talk about in a minute here, there may be alternatives to that in order to cut costs. It's going to be a very interesting time, especially if the market gets really bad macroeconomically. But don't expect this to be the last time we hear of a media merger, apps merging, consolidation, and shows and products being cut. MMA will probably be affected at some point, especially if they are an MMA organization that is not profitable. They're much more likely to be on the chopping block. So we'll see. We'll see what happens, but I think Bellator is safe for now and is definitely in a better position than any other organization except the UFC in terms of being safe. Just because they are profitable, the others still rely on investment and are still loss leaders. But yeah, this is the wild world of streaming. It's only going to get more expensive. It's going to become like cable. There's probably going to be fewer and fewer companies and more mergers. That's my best guess on what's going to happen in the future with all this stuff. All right, next up, we need to talk about a story from our own Marcelo Alonso on Sherdog that states that Combate enters new broadcast era in Brazil, partners with multiple MMA promotions. So, quote, after the world's largest MMA promotion decided to invest in its own streaming platform, which is talking about UFC Fight Pass deal for Brazil, where that's the exclusive home of UFC events now. Many thought that the Combate 24 hours a day martial arts channel would be finished. Instead, the approach of having everything but the UFC at a more affordable price for the subscriber was put into practice. So after signing deals with One Championship, Glory, Rise and Jungle Fight, Top Rank, and Karate Combat, as well as announcing at the time of this recording, PFL, and expected to announce Bellator, which from my sources, I've heard that's imminent. It's pretty much turning Combate into everything but the UFC. They also are cutting their price to be less than half of what was previously charged, where now you can get the service for RS $19.90, which is less than $4 in the US. UFC platform is $29.90. So for less than $10, you can get both UFC events and all the other promotions. Man, it's nice to be a Brazilian MMA fan, at least in that regard. So let's break this down, right? This is something I talked about Disney possibly doing when the UFC media rights deal comes up, where essentially everyone thought Combate is gone. You lost the UFC. Why are people going to watch this? And instead they say, no, we're going to try and survive. We're going to cut our subscriber price quite a bit, and we're going to get every other MMA promotion. So all the hardcore MMA fans, like, all you got to do is sign up for our service. You get everything except the UFC. You got to pay for that separately. It's a very interesting proposition, especially because, as noted in this article, a lot of those other promotions have Brazilian MMA champions. So they could get pushed more, right? We've seen other organizations start to push their champs more and have crossover. Bellator just had Ryan Bader on a talk show host thing with Jerry O'Connell, where Jerry O'Connell's holding pads for him, that type of stuff. This is what I expect Disney will do if they lose the UFC rights. If they lose that bidding war, why not pick up all the rights to all the others? Because as a hardcore MMA fan, right, if you're in that segment of hardcore, you're going to watch all the rest, or at least some of the others. And if you can consolidate them all onto one platform, you're more likely to get subscribers paying for it rather than maybe pirating or figuring VPN out and all that other stuff, right? It's an interesting strategy and it makes a lot of sense. It's the first test case for what I believe will not be the last in terms of other entities trying to consolidate broadcast partnerships with all the other orgs as much as possible if they don't get UFC. Because obviously UFC is the holy grail, right? You get that broadcast deal, and you're getting the maximum amount of MMA fans. Of course you are. But that's not to say there isn't an appetite and enough of a market segment you can't carve out by consolidating all the other shows. In the US, so far, it's hard to kind of prove doing that, right? We've seen the ratings from PFL and Bellator and ONE, and they're obviously significantly lower than the UFC. But if you got all three on, say, ESPN Plus, and you lost the UFC, would people still subscribe to ESPN Plus? That's the real question. That's the test. And it's very interesting because the UFC just went on their largely international market tour, right? Renegotiating rights deals in the UK, setting up, obviously, Fight Pass in Brazil. You had Southeast Asia. You had all these different places. The UFC's been on this tour of their international media rights deals have been up, and they've been getting double what they originally had and trying to renegotiate at a much higher price. This is a scenario where an area that has traditionally had a large MMA fan base, right? They couldn't get a deal done. And so the UFC said, all right, we'll do Fight Pass. And the original broadcast partner says, all right, we'll take everything else. It's the first test case. If Combate does well, I think it's going to be a blueprint to many other international broadcast partners. And I think it could end up hurting the UFC's bottom line because the UFC does not make a ton of money off of Fight Pass stuff, right? If you're doing Fight Pass, especially, which it sounds like in Brazil, they're doing it themselves. Yes, they'll make some money there, but it's far more lucrative to get these international rights deals and broadcast media partners to give you money instead. I know, again, there's certain people out there saying like, oh, they're trying to build this Fight Pass empire of getting these promotions to be exclusively Fight Pass. That doesn't make sense for the UFC. It doesn't give enough of a financial incentive, even if they are feeder leagues, because most of those feeder leagues already were sending fighters anyway. So that doesn't really hold water. For broadcast partners, rather than pay these exorbitant fees, if they can get, even a third or fifth of the subscribers of hardcore MMA fans that watch the UFC to then subscribe to them at greatly reduced prices, the math can still work out for it to be profitable for them. And that's what Combate is trying here, right? It'll be interesting. The number of subscribers, how these shows do viewership-wise are going to be a test case for the international market. Because if Combate does so well, I expect the next time the UFC rights come up in international markets, you're going to see a lot of pushback. You're going to see people say, why would I do that when I can go pay PFL and Bellator and all this stuff? It's competition breeds worse conditions for the UFC's monopoly. And right now, again, UFC far and away the biggest fish in the sea, and nobody's going to catch up to them, right? At least not anytime, probably in my lifetime, or anytime soon. Sans Ali Act expansion or antitrust litigation throwing a huge wrench into it. Not going to happen. But they can still eat into their margins. One of the biggest things of when you have in a particular market or industry, you have a giant fish or a key player that is so far above the rest, it doesn't mean you can't enter the market and still make a profit. It just means you have to find the right places to erode the market share. Because those bigger companies, right, they have flaws. If you're a giant company, it's much harder to adapt to new changes and ever-growing technology, all that type of stuff. And it's also harder for them to give up, especially in the UFC's position, where Endeavor is debt-ridden and the UFC is their main moneymaker. It's hard for them to give up margin. So, again, we've talked about competitive advantages on this show before. These other promotions can come in and win some of these deals and get some of these customers through cost dynamics because they can offer a alternative at a far lower price. Now, from a consumer perspective, right, less than half of what I was paying before, that's not too bad. For all of the other promotions, pretty great. The question is there enough of a market there to make this sustainable? If Combate shuts down in 6 to 8 months, well, then we know, okay, guess not. If it thrives, then we know, okay, it's doable. And again, wouldn't be shocked to see more companies adopt that method, even with the UFC's, home rights coming up. If Disney sees Combate flourish, they may say, okay, I know Bellator's potentially on the market. Already got PFL. Could probably work out something with one. Do we really want to pay, 1.5 to $3 billion for the UFC rights? Or do we want to pay, 30 to 50 million? Or I guess if you outright bought Bellator, probably close to 100, 200 million. And then you own an organization and that covers your rights. It's all about margins. And as I just mentioned, macroeconomic environment turning, suddenly margins become way more important. When debt is cheap, man, they'll throw money at just about anything. Trust me, I've seen it in I don't know how many companies. You got an idea? Sounds good enough? Great. Here's money, run with it. Debt being dirt cheap, yeah, go for it. It costs us nothing to borrow this money. We'll pay it back slowly. It's great. We'll invest it here. We'll invest in this. We'll throw anything at the wall, see what sticks. Oh, great. This product or service is profitable. Perfect. Well worth the investment. But when debt is expensive, all right, we got to tighten things up. We got to be more strategic in our projects and services we select. We've got to find ways to squeeze more money out of efficiencies, all that fun stuff. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be very interesting. If you are a Brazilian fan or Brazilian fans, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Are you excited that Combate is going to be around? And are you going to sign up for all the other promotions? Are you, I really am only interested in the UFC or the occasional show? Probably pass. Love to hear your thoughts on this because this is a very important international market test case for broadcast media rights in all of MMA, not just UFC and the big boys. I mean, it's something that could end up shaking up the market quite a bit. All right, next up we have Prime, the sports drink brand founded by Logan Paul and KSI YouTube superstars, announced a multi-year global marketing partnership that forges an alliance between one of the most popular sports in the world and the fastest growing hydration company. That is directly from the UFC press release. So they are the official global sports drink of the UFC. It replaces Body Armor, which, if you remember Body Armor, Kobe Bryant was a spokesman when they ended up signing with the UFC originally. I think that's part of why he was at that fighter retreat so long ago. But that's now being replaced with Prime. And you're going to see a bunch of never before seen branding inside the world famous Octagon. In addition, Logan Paul and KSI will collaborate on original content that will be distributed through their massively popular social channels, including YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Collectively, they reach nearly 400 million social media followers worldwide. You have Dana White saying, quote, "We're excited to name Prime the official sports drink of the UFC and official partner of the UFC Performance Institute. Logan and KSI have worked hard to build Prime into the best tasting, hottest sports drink on the market. Their massive social media following and the UFC's global reach, we're going to get the Prime brand in front of hundreds of millions of fans all over the world. Whether you're a professional athlete or if you just love working out, Prime should be your first choice for a go-to sports drink." Yeah, gotta love it. Logan Paul went on to say, quote, "I've been a fan of the UFC as long as I can remember, so having the opportunity to partner with them and amplify Prime brand is a check off the bucket list. Together we are a global powerhouse, collaboration, all this stuff, blah, blah, blah." On to the branded integrations and entitlements. So this is great. As the UFC's new official global sports drink partner, Prime's visibility will be highlighted by unprecedented branding in the Octagon at all UFC pay-per-view events and fight nights, as well as Dana White's Contender Series and the Ultimate Fighter. The new branding will include ownership of the Octagon's well-known red and blue corners, which will be renamed Prime Hydration Recovery Zones. Prime's corner branding will also be included on the newly launched Octagon-shaped corner stool, which UFC has developed to coincide with the 30th anniversary campaign. Man, you gotta wonder, hey, UFC's been in business for 30 years. What are we going to do? We're going to build an octagon stool that the fighters sit on. That's how we're going to celebrate 30 years in the business. They are also the exclusive presenting sponsor for all UFC pay-per-view weigh-ins. So there'll be key brand placement during the UFC Fight Week night. Official partner of the Performance Institute, become the presenting sponsor of the Performance Institute's hydration station. Also, it will feature a first-of-its-kind marketing activation. Prime will be named an inaugural presenting partner of the UFC Foundation, an officially recognized nonprofit organization. UFC and Prime will strategically collaborate to develop a charitable youth program that will be administered in under-resourced communities. It will make its debut around UFC 284 Makhachev versus Volkanovski. So I'm assuming that is basically saying, like, we want to do it at UFC 284. We're not sure everything's going to be ready yet. So around that time, maybe not. Yeah. And then, it goes on to talk about Prime, thirst quenching flavors. Okay. All that fun stuff. So just an interesting thing. And it's something where this integration really speaks to, one, the power of YouTube, right? Because from Bloomberg here, a different article, Prime had more than $250 million in retail sales in 2022, with like $1 billion this year behind an aggressive marketing push. So this is part of that marketing push. You can find it in Walmart, Target, Kroger, all that fun stuff. And as part of the arrangement, yes, Paul and KSI will promote drinks on social media channels, et cetera, et cetera. So had to do its own section rather than the quick hits, because this highlights, again, where the UFC is headed. And if you follow pro wrestling at all, they're talking about doing this too, right? Ads everywhere. We've seen ads all over the octagon. We've seen, Crypto.com on the branding, which who knows if that's going to continue. There was the Crypto.com bonuses, which are gone ever since the crypto winter happened. Now you're seeing, we've seen the DraftKings clock. We've seen all this stuff. Now we've seen Battle Motors sponsor the light heavyweight rankings. Now we're seeing stools and Prime Recovery Hydration Stone. So instead of fighting out of the red corner, you're probably going to hear Bruce Buffer say, fighting out of the red Prime Hydration Zone. It's a doozy. But this is a semi-dystopian thing that's been talked about for years and was always where we were heading, right? Advertising everywhere. The UFC is going to continue to make profits through sponsorships and partnerships by selling everything they can, right? You've got the shoes sponsored by the Rock's shoe brand. You've got the outfit sponsored by Venom, and then you got a sponsor on the outfit. You've got the canvas stuff all over. You've got the embedded series with sponsors. You've got the rankings with sponsors, stools with sponsors, a fight clock sponsors. It's where can we sell advertising real estate to? At some point, I would not be shocked if the octagon is just all sorts of colors and it's just full of various sponsorships. Now, they want to keep a certain level of presentation, so they will try to, basically up the price of certain areas rather than sell every bit they can. But this is where the UFC is making money. They've reached a growth. They've gone from the growth phase to a mature company phase where, okay, how can we continue to generate revenue? We pretty much have our costs at the lowest we can get them, at least right now. Where they're making headway there is, again, more and more contender series guys. Eventually, it's going to be all contender series guys. I would not, super bold take, but I think probably by 2035, almost everybody comes from the contender series. I'd say 70, 80% of fighters are from contender series only. Just is what it is. But besides that, right, you've kind of hit your wall. You can't cut costs more than that. Well, okay, we've got media rights deals. Well, we've already got those locked in. Those are going well, but we can't, continually renegotiate those deals throughout the years. And these are, 5-year deals or 7-year deals. It's like, okay, well, this is kind of a bit that we gotta figure out. So where else can we make money? Partnerships. Sponsorships. This is that. This is just another version of that. And you're going to keep seeing this stuff. I mean, I would imagine mouth guards, gloves, that will be on the chopping block eventually too. At some point in the UFC's mind, ideally, they have every ranking sponsored by some brand. You got Battle Motors on light heavyweight, and I don't know, the hot dog branding on middleweight. I don't know, it's just that's what they're going for here. That's what this is. People are looking at this like this is ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous. It's not the end. It's still very much the middle / beginning. This is how the UFC will continue to make money in 2023 and beyond. Expect more of this. I've said that before on this podcast a million times. It's going to get even crazier. They have not saturated all of their opportunities yet. And they will keep aggressively pushing to make these deals. And for the brands, obviously they see something in the UFC's viewership and growth where they say, okay, we want it too. And my guess is they've got numbers on their end that say, okay, great, this is working for us. And if it's not, they'll fall out and another person will step in. But yeah, this is the new normal when it comes to these sponsorships. You're going to hear every certain glove brand, everything renamed to something in particular. Bruce Buffer is going to have a list a mile long talking about all these things. It's something else. Will you see Logan or KSI in the octagon? Wouldn't be shocked if they took it to that level. I don't know that they will, but I would not be shocked if, much like with WWE and Logan stepping in there, you see at some point Logan get the CM Punk treatment, go in and fight a scrub or somebody pretty new, and that's that. Would not be shocked at all. And I know Anton over at Bloody Elbow had asked, hey, are you going to do something for fighter pay? Jake Paul responded. It was directed to Jake Paul. He said something, then Logan retweeted. We got something in mind for that. Who knows if that actually comes to fruition? But yeah, it's not shocking. It's just business, folks. Going to see a lot more of this. Love to hear your thoughts on the red and blue prime rehydration zones. I cannot wait for Bruce Buffer to see it. It's amazing. All right, only got 2 things for quick hits this time around, but they're important. So first is that the United Fight League has announced a Grand Prix, and it is a MMA organization founded by Harrison Rogers, who is an entrepreneur, has Quentin Rampage Jackson as part of it, and as well as Tito Ortiz. And it sounds, at least the announcement is, they're going to do full medical coverage for fighters. So that's a PPO that can be bought into rather than the standard like coverage that's just there for training and then in camp and fighting. And then you're kind of on your own. This is a full PPO medical, and they're adding life insurance, apparently. It's a big deal for a lot of reasons. I made it a quick hit because, again, it's a newer organization. Want to see if this is actually going to stick and happen. If this continues, I'm going to be covering it because those are the type of benefits that really blur the line between independent contractor and employee. And so we would have to dive into that more, but it's something to keep an eye on. It's very intriguing. Curious to see what the fighters say about it. Curious to see if the organization gets some traction, and also curious to see if anybody challenges at any point, if there's a dispute with the contract, that they're an employee rather than a contractor. Because that, again, massive ramifications. An example of this would be, imagine you have a UFL fighter who becomes kind of a breakout star, wants to go to the UFC or another promotion. That is blocked by UFL, which we've seen some of these feeder leagues do before, right? And says, nope, can't do that. Well, if the person then sues and says, actually, I'm an employee, and based on this contract, I should be an at-will employee, so you can't stop me. Could be a whole thing. Now that's way down the road, all this other stuff, but it's interesting. We'll see if other promotions follow suit. We'll see if it actually helps them out, because this will be more costly, but this might give them a spark. And obviously you got Tito and Rampage. So yeah, we'll see where it goes, but very interesting stuff. The other thing that I wanted to cover on quick hits, this really the only other thing I'm going to cover for this section, is Bloody Elbow has lost its funding by Vox. Their notification sent out to pretty much everybody You had Kid Nate get the first layoff notice, and then now all individual contributors, they're essentially shutting down Bloody Elbow's Vox site. Doesn't mean Bloody Elbow won't try and survive. I've seen and heard things where they're going to try and make it independently. It's going to be a lot harder, right? Especially for the full-time guys. I mean, that's going to be real rough. But Bloody Elbow is an important site. Obviously, I quote John Nash on here a ton. And it's been kind of a bastion of independent journalism where they often run stories that other publications won't run. Only heard good things about that place. So it's important enough to bring up here because of its effect on MMA media, right? We've talked about the realities of MMA media not that long ago. And this is unfortunately a sad side effect where in the new click-based era, this type of stuff that Bloody Elbow puts out doesn't always make the most money or views. So I don't know where things go from here with those guys. I wish them all the best luck. I hope they survive independently, but it's a big deal just because that has been a staple of the MMA, truer to journalism than MMA kind of reporting in media space for a long time now. And the fact it's going to lose its funding from Vox is a big hit to the industry. So shout out to all those guys. Hope they land on their feet. And yeah, will be interesting to see if they do and if those pieces and some of the things that are kind of highlighted there go away or not. Hoping not, but is what it is. Let me know if I missed any other quick hits. I know I probably did, but wanted to just focus on those two. If there's anything else you thought was super relevant that I should have brought up, let me know. I will bring it up next week. All right, last thing I'm going to cover today, and I'm going to make it relatively quick just because it's a bit of speculation, right? Conor McGregor sent out a tweet essentially saying he was offered a spot to coach the Ultimate Fighter. He was thinking about it. Tony Ferguson chimed in, said that it should be Ferguson versus McGregor, all this stuff. And whether or not that will actually happen, who knows? They've both been known to tweet things that never come to fruition. But I wanted to take a look at it because it obviously stirred up enough buzz. What would happen with the Ultimate Fighter if Conor McGregor coached now? So he coached back against Uriah Faber in 2015 when he was still kind of on the rise, right? He wasn't at the pinnacle of McGregor hype as he was still, making his way up the ranks at that point. Now he's become this major crossover star, branding. His tweets are regularly posted as news. We just talked about with the Click media ship, like his stuff does really well. Even if it's like, what's going on? This is something tweet. You will see most of the major publications, right? Oh, McGregor said this, or because it gets the type of views that's needed. So it's one of those things where what would it be like if at this point McGregor coaches the Ultimate Fighter? Would it actually boost the ratings through ESPN Plus? Would it be a big deal? And is it a good deal for the UFC? Is it a good deal for McGregor? Because I'm sure they'd have to pay McGregor a fair amount of money. And would it really raise McGregor's stock? For McGregor, I think it could end up being great for him. Reason being, depending on how he acts on that show and the editing is done, it could really rehab his image, right? He's obviously had a lot of image problems as of late between multiple arrests, tweeting out a bunch of stuff, seemingly under the influence. It's image of his has been tarnished quite a bit, and he hasn't fought in a long time. When he has fought, he hasn't won. Or let me rephrase that. He's fought semi-recently, but in terms of his latest fights, it's still, once a year or kind of around that time, and he hasn't been winning. It's been hurting his stock and star power. He's still a big enough name. He's still made enough money that he's still a draw, but it's probably starting to diminish at this point. And so him doing the Ultimate Fighter and painting himself in a particularly good light, coaching people a particular way, could rehab his image quite a bit. And especially if he does that, and then if he's fighting somebody like Ferguson, where he'd probably be heavily favored, he comes back, wins in the octagon, it could be a feel-good comeback story. And that always seems to do well in the media, right? Everybody loves a comeback story. Geno Smith, for example, the NFL, that's a huge thing. Could be great for him. it's probably worth it for him if he's trying to rehab his image and he wants to put the effort into that. For the UFC, is it worth the cost, right? And the danger? Because if McGregor goes on that show and acts like a fool and it's painted in a negative light, I'm not sure that helps him. Now it's behind ESPN Plus, so it's probably only going to be hardcore fans watching, but at the same time, that's something where you might have a casual viewer who has ESPN Plus for various sport reasons look and see, oh, McGregor's coaching, I wonder what he's like, and checking him out. And if they're turned off by McGregor's behavior, well, that's not good, because obviously he's the biggest drawer of casual eyes right now. So it's a little bit risky there. And you're also going to have to pay McGregor, I'm sure, a lot of money to coach the Ultimate Fighter. So is it worth it? It's pretty risky right now. There's been no behavioral change indications rather, that McGregor is going to, paint himself in a completely different light that helps his image. Right now, he's kind of, doing the same thing that he's been doing for quite a while. And it doesn't appear like he's making an effort to, I want to really change things up. So if I'm a marketing executive, the UFC, or if I'm the top brass, I might say, I don't know that I necessarily want to put him in that show, because yes, he might do some outrageous stuff that then draws enough eyeballs. It piques viewers, and maybe that makes ESPN happy, helps with the rights negotiation coming up. Okay, that's a possible outcome. But if it turns off the casual fans more, it's not great. And the Ultimate Fighter hasn't done well with ratings, right? It depends. Is ESPN dying for the Ultimate Fighter to do really well? Do they want content to really hit big numbers? Well, then this is something that would help do that. And then it doesn't really matter what his behavior is like. If that's your end goal, perfect. If your end goal is to get McGregor's image rehabbed and to get him to draw more, it's probably not worth the risk for the UFC and the cost for the UFC. Because there's no guarantee more people are going to watch the Ultimate Fighter just because McGregor's on it. Well, let me phrase that. More people are going to watch, but you don't know how many more people. It's almost certainly a guarantee more people are going to watch if McGregor is coaching, but you don't know how many more and if it's going to be worth the cost and the effort. It all comes down to that calculus for the UFC. If they want to make a big splash with ESPN and say, look, this is why you need to keep us and pay us more money for the rights. We're giving you UFC events, but then look at this show. Look, we're going to bring McGregor on here. I'm sure they'll talk about bringing bigger stars on there to coach. Okay, then sure. ESPN loves it, laps it up, worth it. If that's not your end goal, or you've gotten an indication from your partnership that ESPN doesn't care about that right now, and they're looking for other methods of monetary, they're like, yeah, we don't really need that. Well, that's a little bit tougher. And I'm not sure it's worth the risk. So it could be a good deal, could be a bad deal. I think for McGregor, no matter what, it's a good deal because it gives you more spotlight time. And as long as you don't do something like egregious, unforgivable, you're going to be fine, which in the Ultimate Fighter house, I imagine would be harder for that to happen, but you never know. I don't know. It's a tough one. Let me ask you guys this. Would you be more interested in an Ultimate Fighter show if McGregor was coaching? Would you watch the whole thing? Or would you still need to see this? Not my thing. I'm very curious from a hardcore perspective if it really does kind of pique your interest enough. Like, I might check it out even though I haven't watched the last seasons, or I watch all the seasons. This would make me more interested, or I'd hate it. No, I would turn off if McGregor's there. Love to hear your thoughts there. But yeah, it's an interesting proposition. Don't know that's going to happen. Could just be another McGregor tweet, but something to think about. All right, that wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast. Appreciate you guys as always for listening. Hit the like, subscribe, bell notification button if you're listening on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, what have you. Love you guys as always. Last week had some personal things come up, which is why we didn't have a podcast then, but definitely going to keep the normal calendar from here on out, as well as should be seeing a new type of video format, breaking down some business stuff coming out very soon. I'm hoping in the next couple weeks is what I'm aiming for. So I will keep you guys apprised of that, but it's part of what I've been working on for a while now.